If we dump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the world as a whole warms.
The long-term trend continues to show a warming cycle throughout the world.
The overall trend is one of sort of warming, particularly warming winters.
For the Atlantic provinces, well, the summers are changing, the winters are changing. Winter seems to be starting later and later every year.
Years ago, you would never hear tell of getting freezing rain or rain in the winter time. And but the last couple of years, it happens. It's not uncommon to have a green Christmas.
In the early 70s, when the ground froze the 15th of November, it never thawed out again till the 1st of April. Now, before Christmas we were wading mud. After Christmas we were wading mud. And
10 years, I could see a big difference in the weather pattern. We don't get that cold weather staying so long now. If you get a week of cold weather now, it's over,
Just like the bear right now. This is January and he's still wandering around and he should be sleeping.
Bear are waking up earlier, coming out of their dens a little bit earlier and checking things out.
The sow would be having her young right about now, and she's sleeping and she's feeding that young. But it's too warm, and she's active.
I don't know whether that's air temperature or ground temperature, but it does affect them. They are coming out earlier, and they're staying out later.
There has been an increase in ambient temperature over the last few years, and that changes some of the crops that can be grown. You can grow crops that require more heat units than we could before, some of the corn crops, maybe the soybean crops and so on.
People are growing weeping mulberry trees, which in the 1980s you would have lost. They're growing peach trees even in certain areas.
The seasons are getting longer here, so you add 2 weeks to the season and you can grow 2-3 more different varieties.
What it shows is that there is a consistent general pattern that has changed.
Water temperature has been warming up in the Bay of Fundy, and you're starting to see the right whale moving up more all the time.
We're getting unbelievable catches here in the fall. The last 2 years has been record-breaking. I think it's the lobster are moving further north for colder water.
I've been here about 31 years living in the village, and I've seen a change in different areas, but most of it's from the power of the sea.
The oceans themselves are just essentially expanding because of the increased temperatures in the atmosphere. So we have this thermal expansion problem. So the tides, the water levels are naturally rising just because of that extra energy in the atmosphere.
It's of concern. You're talking potentially a meter, maybe 1.5 meters by 2100.
If global warming continues or gets worse, where the Arctic ice caps are going to melt more than they already are, and seawaters are going to rise more, and we know that the isthmus, the ground is actually sinking.
All of the landscape here at the head of the Bay of Fundy is actually going down. Technically, it's called subsidence. It ripples out of the after effect of the last glaciation.
These are communities that are very, very vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. We have a lot of subsided areas that exist behind dikes, and we've had a lot of development behind those dikes.
So the two put together with the sea levels rising and the ground levels reducing, you can see that it's going to be increasingly hard to maintain the dikes.
The dikes are now a subject to concern because a few things are happening. First of all, they're eroding quicker than they would have in the past. And second, they're not quite high enough.
In these areas, because they are the low-lying areas, if we get a lot of heavy precipitation, those areas are going to fill up, such as areas of Truro, for example.
The biggest threat probably from climate change is sea level rise, and therefore the vulnerability of our infrastructure to damage or inaccessibility during floods, damage to human life as well as land and property.
Sea level rise is an issue, but even then these storm surges we were discussing before cause massive problems for anybody living too close to shore.
If you get a heavy northeast wind here and you get an extremely high tide, you're definitely going to get a surge.
Worst storm surges we get here are on the order of about 1.5 meters, maybe up to 2 meters in extreme cases.
If you've ever seen a tide surge, it's something like a mini tsunami in a way. You can actually sit there and you can watch it coming up the street, eh?
In the future, with warmer ocean temperatures, one could expect that hurricanes coming up would retain their energy longer.
We have tropical storms now that are pretty intense. You combine that with rising sea levels, and you've got a recipe for disaster.
When we're talking about Atlantic Canada, we're talking about a place that expects hurricanes. Hurricanes are a part of our natural climate.
The hurricane season, eh? How much the hurricanes have changed. They've changed in intensity. They seem to be changing their track. An awful lot coming up off of Nova Scotia. Once they get off of Nova Scotia, they kind of turn to the north and come in over land there, right?
If you're in New York City and you're worried, you should be worried, because I don't think you're going to fix it very easily. It's going to be an expensive proposition. It'll be like being in Venice. You'll have to build gates and kind of rock fortifications against the sea outside and try to control the rising tides periodically.
We are a coastal community in terms of Atlantic Canada, historically and currently. We continue to be drawn to the water, and that water regime is changing significantly.
The community scale is critical. The impacts are felt locally by individuals, by households, by communities, and though that's the level where people have to deal with the consequences of changes that are occurring at broader scales.
You've got this coastal settlement pattern that really relies on a stable environmental condition, and it's anything but.
We've definitely had more shore erosion, and I attribute that to rising tide levels, more severe weather occurrences. You're getting higher winds, you're getting higher tides, you're getting storm surges.
It's quite clear that the changes that were experienced in the anomalous winters of 2009, 2010, they demonstrate the impact that has had on people.
People can be exposed to evenly to particular impacts and climate trends and events, but not everybody is affected by those trends in the same way.
There's so many interlocking impacts that it makes much more sense, rather than focusing on a specific thing, it's often better to focus on a specific community. We take a small community of a few hundred people, like say Ferryland, and just focus on what's happening to them.
The climate is changing. Occasionally we have a period of time when the storms are much more intense.
And we're seeing storms when they come to be far stronger than they would have been historically. The wave action is heavier, and I think it's partly because of the rising tides.
The main breakwater in our main economic area of town. In 2004, it was taken by the sea and was replaced, at least the most damaged part of it. That lasted until around 2008. But then in 2008 and 2009, starting in October, there was damage. Again in December, there was damage. And again in January, there was damage. In 1 year, there were a series of intense storms. And the following year, not quite as bad, but still more intense. So now we are in the process of replacing it. The construction now, the holes are deeper, and not only do we have the cribbing itself and the back cribbing, but armour stone against the front of it. So all that has made it stronger. It's supposed to be able to deal with a more serious storm than we've had up to now.
In many cases, people are just going to have to move away from the seashore because of the costs involved.
The town is only 465 people at the present time, and we really do not have the financial wherewithal to replace it. The breakwater we're putting up there at the present time is costing $900,000. Our share is $86,000, which is a lot for a small town. If it goes again, we won't be able to deal with it.
If you see the ocean in its fury, you see the storms off here when they're really wild, you know that it's no good trying to protect against that in the long haul. You better start planning for some alternate kind of living accommodations.
Our main concern is to highlight the problem of the small town trying to protect the coastline.
definitely believe that's what it is, climate change for sure.
Now it seems like we're starting to get the hurricanes more. As they come up the coast, they seem to be coming right towards us now.
It's obvious that when you have that much rain, and it's been, 100 years unrecorded, so there's something not quite right going on.
Apparently 2 dikes broke, and with all the rain, and we're in the flat, the rain runs down off the hill, and so yeah, we just happened to be in the wrong place, the wrong time kind of thing. The water didn't really start to bother me until I seen swells like 7 and 8 feet. And even 10 feet at some times, and that was scary. I went and got our girls from school. I was a little nervous. I didn't know if they were going to close the schools, and we were trapped between the train tracks and the bridge here.
I was about 8 inches above my knee there in water trying to get the vehicles out of here up on higher ground there, right? So it was a good thing we got them moved when we got them moved.
5 feet or below is soaked and ruined. Clothing, motorcycles, snowmobiles, all of that stuff. There's a lot of damage here.
My old tank, it was half full from the water was in the basement. It was lifted in the air. That is where they use their hose to fill up the tank. They were flipped right here. So it means the gas tank was lifted. The water was right here. 8 steps. I called my insurance broker. He was here. He took some photos from what happened, and really he was shocked when he came down here. He said he never seen like this in his life. It is not a flood. It is a disaster, actually.
The water just came in. It was all in a matter of about a half an hour. It was pretty hard to walk out. You couldn't. You had to be careful. It could have knocked you over if you weren't paying attention. Yeah, I think about moving, but now that you're kind of stuck in the place, to be able to just pick up, somebody's going to buy it. If no one's going to buy it, then you're kind of stuck with the risk, and you stay here.
I think every one of these things that keep happening here is a learning experience for Truro.
Why can't we build a dam or a dike to stop this from happening? It's not fair, it's not right.
They should just leave it. Don't try and build the dikes back up. Because obviously you're not going to stop that river from breaking through.
I rent. So, if I had to move, I would have to move. You do what you got to do with your families.
Hopefully that is not going to happen again. Otherwise, I don't know people how they're going to be living in this town anymore.
Climate change is here, and anybody who doesn't believe it, just get up and look out the window. You'll see it.
The water's getting higher, the sea level, there seems to be more storm surges, there seems to be more storms, period.
We're seeing it all the time. There's more and more. The tides never seem to be low anymore. They seem to be high, and higher.
If we do get some sou'westers, you're going to see about 3 feet go off those banks every time they start pounding.
I mean, if you look at the mainland, their coastlines are basically made up of granite and heavy rock. Ours is made up of sandstone, which is easily torn down.
This was a point. All this was a point coming away out to here, and we used to pull our boats up. Now it's all gone, eh?
Even just the natural erosion in the springtime, from freeze and thaw, you get a storm, it multiplies that by a factor of probably hundreds of thousands.
People are saying when I was a kid, there used to be all kinds of bank swallows along the shore. Now we hardly ever see one. What's causing that?
And you notice that that's a soft bank. Every time the waves pound that thing, it just comes down a bit. The cliff swallows are all gone. Those banks used to have hundreds of cliff swallows. Now that it's falling around so much, they can't get their holes. They dig in about, quite a little ways, and they're all gone.
We're losing so much coastline that we don't have that buffer area along the coastline.
I've been putting the buoys out, marking the harbour here, probably 35 years.
Tides are different. Tides are changing.
It's high tide and higher. There's no high and low. Like years ago, you get a low tide, you can get a bucket of clams anywhere, tide would be low. Now it's very seldom that you get a low tide.
The fisherman in Victoria that told me that he's noticed when you tie up your boat, like the water's higher now because the boat is closer to the top of the wharf.
Whether it's because the ice is melting up north or in a pot, hot water is higher than cold water.
Like that lighthouse up in up West Point, the tide came in so high, it was right up to the foundation of the lighthouse. And there had been a big sand dune and a boardwalk and everything in front of it. And was all washed out. And unfortunately, those types of storms are going to get more frequent.
There's never been a state of emergency declared in this village yet. The closest one we had was about 2 years ago when we had, I guess they call it the 100-year tidal surge.
21st of December, and that's the first day of winter. And then at that time it was the full moon, and we had a storm. It lasted 2 or 3, 4 days.
Streets down close to the wharf had approximately 1 meter of water on the streets, which cut off the lower end of the village towards Rustico Harbour. Couldn't get through with any equipment.
I got about 360 feet of waterfront. Well, 15 feet of land was gone. Like I said, I got my own private wharf. Well, the wharf was gone. I had to build a new wharf.
It was almost up to the centre of the community here. We had to barricade off several of the streets, and I think there was 85 homes that were completely isolated due to the water.
There's a bridge right at the end of my property, like the main bridge, and that bridge was closed down for 2 days because the tide was over the bridge, and there was like driftwood and stuff on the bridge after, so you had to clean it off.
The one up here about 6 miles up the road, Oysterbed Bridge, it was put out of commission for at least 6 or 8 weeks.
We made a presentation one day at the Gulf Shore School in North Rustico, shortly after the December 21st, 2010 storm surge. The kids were all very interested in it, and they all remembered going across one of those bridges on a bus where the waves were crashing over the side of the bridge, and they had never seen that before. It may be a day that they'll remember for the rest of their life.
It greatly affects our sewer system. From the sea tide pushing in, the water was shooting out of this manhole about this high on that day. When the tide gets that high, we can't handle the amount of stormwater coming into the sanitary system, so we need to address that situation.
Saltwater intrusion in aquifers. We've done a couple of studies on that. We're kind of concerned about sea level rise causing more penetration of the salt water into fresh water.
All water in PEI is groundwater, so it's well water. It's pumped up and fed through a distribution system.
There's getting to be more frequent instances of salt water showing up in their wells.
That was probably, I'd say, 20, 25 years since we had a storm like that bad. We had them before, like you get them every now and then, but they're more often now too.
We're leaning more towards the weather-related events now, sitting on the ocean. Especially with the hurricane systems now are changing and becoming more frequent and getting a lot closer every day to be prepared for that type of an event.
All those things are adding up, and we're going to have to do something about our road construction, our bridge construction, and shoreline protection systems.
But if it keeps going the way it's going in 50 years, and like if the tide keeps coming and coming, we're going to have to raise the island.
And that's the thing. We live on an island and it's shrinking.
We call it Indian Island because of the island over here, and there used to be our ancestors used to live there and dance there. There was dancing circles on the island, so we sort of lived on a peninsula here, but we called it Indian Island.
That's just where we lived all our lives, along the water. I used to walk around the island, go around the island, picking the arrowheads.
We're surrounded by water mostly, and it's just beautiful. We try to protect it and try to stay here as long as we can before Mother Nature tells us we gotta go.
Global warming, and naturally the water rises up, and then storms are getting worse. Some of the shores here are taking a beating. Nor'easters here are atrocious. Luckily that the administration here and the studies they've done realize that we need to do something to protect our reserve here.
We did the sea level rise study. What they did was fly over the reserve. They took the sea level rise as what it was and how the scientists predicted the melting of the ice caps coming up. They measured the level of the First Nation. And what we found out after the study was done, that Indian Island in possibly 80 years will be underwater just in a high tide due to sea level rise. As soon as we had that study done, a storm surge hit, one of the biggest storm surges in a while, 2 years ago, I believe, just before Christmas. One tip of our reserve was underwater.
The water gets so high, like the last storm was coming right up to the building here.
The water had come up to this gazebo right here. That's how far it came in. In storm surges, they might have come up to the lower fence here just a bit, and we've had seaweed on it. But now, that last one 2 years ago that hit us quite hard, buried the fence.
And we had quite an emergency, and it was a scary one, and it was a sad one because it was happened just before Christmas. Some people had their Christmas trees and presents in the basement. Floods occurred, and it was not just our First Nation, it was Eel River Bar and Burnt Church, Restigouche, places like that. That live right on the coast really took a beating. After that storm, we realized we had a really big problem, and that the study that they had done was accurate. When we started to negotiate with Indian Affairs, province of New Brunswick, and saying, we got to do something to protect this First Nation. There's a lot of families here. It's a disaster waiting to happen. Eventually got enough funding to build a whole reserve up. Other communities are looking to what we've done here to adapt.
We started about a year and a half ago, roughly. It started in the spring, the construction of the road and the building up of the rock. So we've built up here. You can see for yourselves how high. I guess it's 12 feet or more, and it's now created a berm. So hopefully this berm holds out the water. So the problem we've created is a bowl. So now for adaptation, we have to start putting in drain pipes, possibly here, possibly down there, possibly over there.
We're going to be raising houses so that the basements are not underground, so that if the water does come over or comes up from underneath, they're not flooding.
We start to build this new addition to our band office, and we built it higher, above everything else. We're getting ready for storms. In case a storm surge comes in, it won't come into the band office. And it was a good call, because the old band office, the way it was, it would have come right into the band office. Now this saved us.
We've got the province to agree to build up the road, so there's I believe at least 6 feet built up, and so that gives us an escape route if it comes over.
The last storm, the water was just level. I was just standing there looking at it. I said, you come up another 15 minutes and I'm gone. I'm going to get out of here. Kind of scary.
It's going to be a scary one. We'll have to put people on alert. We have to tell people that a storm surge is coming. Maybe a storm surge that may come over. We have to have people prepared, vehicles prepared. We have to have an emergency plan so that our elders are taken out. Nobody is forgotten. Everybody is safe.
And it's sad to say that we're just buying time. But there's going to be a day when Mother Nature says, no, you can't live here no more. Our graveyard will be underwater. My mother and my brothers, they're laid out there. My uncles, my aunts, people I grew up with and knowing. I sometimes think about their spirits and what they would say to me. Yeah, move me, leave me here. It's just to disturb their resting place. Do I do that? Do I make that decision? Yeah, dig them up, move them elsewhere. I sometimes try to think of what they would tell me.
I like this place. I was born here. My grandparents were born here, my father. So I hate to see it go underwater.
Global warming, that's happening. Some of us admit it, some of us realize it, some of us deny it, some of us don't know. Those of us that don't know, those people don't know, we have to approach them in a way that they'll understand, right? And those of us that do realize it is, what is it we're going to do about it? You know what I mean? And this is very important, to share the experience of we're in trouble.
I don't know if I'll see it in my time where Indian Island will be right underwater. Maybe I will. We'll see in the years to come. But it's a sad day because I grew up on these rivers. I grew up fishing them. I grew up on the beaches cooking, and it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart to think that, you know, someday I'll have to leave this area.
In the end, it's the people on the local scale that really can help identify the changes that are occurring, or really help to give shape to how climate change is currently manifesting.
Sometimes you need a big event to make people realize that this isn't just an academic exercise of something that might happen. This is actually happening for real.
And hopefully from there, help people understand or extrapolate what's going to happen to climate in the future.
And municipalities take the brunt of that in terms of planning, certainly, and infrastructure impacts.
Whether it's Halifax, Dartmouth, whether it's the larger communities of Fredericton or Moncton, they're all vulnerable.
If you lay out the facts, you know, the climate change is happening, the water levels are rising, you know, the probability of flooding is increasing, and that the dikes are incapable of withstanding that out on, you know, some of these scenarios. I think once you've explained that, people are just generally concerned.
I don't think we'd be the only place in the world with trouble on our hands, but you'd have to deal with it. And if you're a strong community and you have, you know, some smart people and some people willing to look at these problems and come up with solutions, then you're halfway there. But if you're a community that doesn't really function anymore, then you're really in trouble. Because how do you deal with the problems if you don't have the resources to deal with them?
You got to get the community organizations involved, right? That's your main source of equipment and manpower, if you will, in the event of any emergency.
They take ownership because it's their community, and they want to make it better for the future.
We have renewable energy resources in Nova Scotia that are excellent. They're very, very good. We can build wind fields. We can use that energy to power homes. We can use that energy to power our transportation, our vehicles. It's a very exciting time.
We have a company capable of putting together this project that resulted in the first turbine and now more. And the idea is to make it possible for us to use the energy which is going by here every day.
Well, the turbine behind me is an Intercon called an E53. It's 73 meters tall and it has 53 meter diameter blades. It produces upwards of 800 kilowatts on a windy day, and it's connected to the local grid, local distribution grid. So the wires leave here, go straight down the hill, join wires that travel to Tatamagouche. It powers all the homes on the way, and it powers the businesses in Tatamagouche.
It's something that you can grasp. There is the source of the power, and here's where you use it. And we didn't burn one lump of coal to do that. And that carries a very strong message. We didn't have to make a mess in order to live here and use that power.
Local people recognize the importance of this, and wanting to actually make money in the green economy, we were able to gather large amounts of money, over $2 million in share sales.
So we have a loyal group of shareholders who like the idea that they have ownership of something that's here, that's theirs. And we have a wind that's very cooperative in bringing that energy, so that we have this meeting of minds and nature. It's a nice mix.
It's simple to understand how a turbine making electricity can power our homes, but to make the connection to transportation is really important.
David Swan was 20 years working on practically all the electric cars that we will ever hear about in the next few years. And he has brought with him that promise of a different way of looking at transportation.
I've worked in electric cars for so long to actually see them become commercialized and actually available in Halifax. Now the next step is to have people buy them and participate in this and be part of the solution.
When we talk about how do I like driving this car, I just love the idea that more and more it's wind power that makes transportation easier and much better for the environment. It's cutting into the burning of coal than the burning of gasoline. So how do I like this car? Boy, this is the future.
By far, the majority of the oil that we consume in the world goes to transportation, goes to automobiles, trucks, airplanes, and so on. And the link of transportation to electricity suddenly lets us to make that big change, that big leap from going from oil to being able to power our transportation by renewable means.
Well, we need some charging stations then so people will buy electric cars. So now it's starting to come together and more electric vehicles are coming to market.
The green economy is a new economy that emphasizes things that are sustainable. Sustainable means long-term solutions, not another short-term solution where you drill an oil well, it's good for 10 years, and then you have to move on. And whoever services these cars, they become part of that green economy. The building of these wind turbines, operating them, that's all part of the green economy. And what's so important about that is in Nova Scotia, right now, we import all of our oil. That means millions of dollars leave every week from this province to supply those fuels. If we produce the electricity here renewably, we drive electric cars, that's all staying at home. That's money going in a circle. It gives us jobs, it makes us sustainable for the future.
We're making a mess of it in general, but if we can start to clean up here and there, then and keep increasing those pods, then we'll all be better off.
Due to climate change, we're going to be forced to adapt to it, no matter what we do. And what we're trying to do here is mitigate it somewhat and reduce our impact, be part of the solution.
We are coastal communities. We are coastal provinces. How are we going to adapt to these real changes?
Climate change is happening, and it's going to continue to happen no matter what we do. And we have to adapt to that now, rather than wait for a major event.
If there is an emergency situation that's beyond the capability of the community council to handle, the mayor would have to declare a state of emergency, then the EMO committee would take over.
We certainly saw an awful lot of that during Igor as well, with people just getting out and whatever resources they had, they were putting it into acting. And no outside government could have replaced that, on its own, certainly. So that local action was extremely critical.
I was here for Igor. Igor passed us by. We were kind of in a little window. But it tore the rest of the province apart on the east coast, yeah. It was wicked. And frightening. I mean, you look at the damage it does.
Would we need heavy equipment to move trees off the road? Would we need crews with chainsaws, things of that nature, to cut it up, to remove it? Power, emergency generators? We have all the lists of all the people that we can contact and have the equipment at hand as required.
Hurricane Igor just missed us, went a little bit to the west of us. And all kinds of infrastructure that was supposed to be able to take, stormwater and so on, just didn't. And now they're talking about building back to a higher standard, bigger culverts, for example.
If culverts aren't maintained properly, then you get localized flooding. In proactive communities, when they know there's an extreme weather event coming, they're out checking the areas where they know problems can occur.
Well, I don't think there's any debate any longer that our climate is changing.
And this is where we're seeing the Insurance Bureau of Canada coming in with some very good, solid solutions now. Their tagline at the moment is that water is the new fire.
The insurance industry, the trends that we're seeing, it's very clear that we're getting more water more often and at peak times that increasingly is overwhelming our infrastructure.
Now the industry's saying it's water that's the new issue. So you have to have infrastructure. And so there are all sorts of green technologies now that allow us to deal with infrastructure. As simple as having a rain barrel where you don't have runoff, of having a minimum amount of building capacity on a private lot where you leave soil available instead of paving or building it all over, so having massive runoff, having storm drainage systems, having gray water systems.
The focus of our industry is adapting to this and recognizing that today and tomorrow and next month there are going to be Canadians who will have their lives turned upside down from a a risk that right now they're oblivious to.
And we have a number of examples across the region that if adopted by government on a wholesale basis, would really quickly allow us to solve some of these pressing issues.
One of the biggest issues really is coastal development and where people want to put their cottages or their homes.
We had communities say to us, well, if there's no provincial policy on not building in floodplains, for example, or in areas that are sensitive to slope movement, then if we regulate people in our local land use regulations and the neighboring communities don't, then, you see movement of people into areas where there are fewer regulations.
Everybody wants to be near the water and have a view of the water, and for municipal governments, it's often challenging to try to bring in land use plans or bylaws or guidelines where you limit the right of people to build wherever they want.
We do have our own official plan and bylaws, and we do issue our own building permits. And I think there should be a component in your building permit that addresses climate change and increased tidal and storm surges. And if you're going to build, it should be addressed.
When you have our major cities in these vulnerable areas, planners are this frontline defense against these surges, so that common practice is one of a setback. Don't build there. If you're going to build there, then it should be a certain height. It should be a certain distance from the shoreline.
Any new development has to be higher than the worst case scenario predicted out to the next 100 years.
The municipal plan has to embody what this community will look like 10 and 20 and 30 years down the road.
Sea level rise out to 2100, the worst case storm surge event, combined together, it gives you a level of, say, maybe let's say 4 meters above sea level.
It's through those abilities to recognize environmental change that we have to build those into our communities, and so it can be done.
My sense is that people are very resilient.
Resilience is certainly part of the character of this place. Yeah, you have to be resilient to live here, and you have to have a good sense of humor, because nature is not going to let you off the hook.
You take the people with the traditional knowledge, they've had to adapt over their times for different things, and sometimes they have very good input as to what to do or where to go.
When people see their knowledge and their contributions as being valued, they then have a stake in what's being done, and they're part of the decisions that are being made about adaptation. So including their knowledge is a really important piece in having a shared understanding of what needs to happen in order to adapt to climate change.
The climate change adaptation question, as well as the prevention, the mitigation side, is very complicated and varied. And you can't look to one branch of government or one level of government to say this is how we will fix it. It's going to require a lot of cooperation across levels of government with the private sector, with community and society, civil society organizations.
We've influenced climate in the past, and we're going to continue to influence in the future. So we should start adapting to what's coming now rather than wait.
We've had the international community looking at climate change. We now have a very strong set of indicators on a regional basis in Atlantic Canada. This is a wonderful opportunity for governments individually and collectively to come together and start putting those legislated pieces together and allowing for sustainable communities.
We have to be proactive and stop being reactive to these scenarios. And we've known a lot of these issues for a long time now. And so now it's time that we really have to financially commit to making some changes.
Leadership, we do need people to drive this. And the grassroots pressure and knowledge and awareness saying to these governments, get on with it and just don't play politics with it is really an important part of the process.
It's happening now. It's something that the world leaders are going to have to tackle. It's not something they can just throw a few dollars at and pretend it's going to go away.
If you're worrying about climate change, then you're at least ahead of the game. If you're putting off thinking about climate change, if you're putting off thinking about adaptation because you think perhaps climate change isn't occurring or will just turn back around, then you're setting yourself up for greater and greater costs when the climate change actually does occur.
With the climate debate, we're somewhat back compared with the lung cancer issue. There's a sort of latency period. And people can go on smoking and feel perfectly healthy and not know that they're committing themselves to some fatal illness 20 years down the road.
Change is the result of our actions. We've learned to burn things very well. We burn 90 million barrels of oil every day. If you take those barrels, you stack one on top of the other, you touch the moon in less than 3 days. That's how significant our consumption is. Now, moving away from that because of climate change or other good reasons, it's just a good thing to do. Why should we burn all this stuff in a few generations?
The rest of the climate change we're talking about isn't simple. There aren't just a few targets, and it's not even just coal and fossil fuels. It's a whole range of things, all woven through our lifestyle.
Man has become greedy. We've lost our way. We are not satisfied with what we have, and we want more and more and more and more, and there's no stopping us. We will not slow down.
I only hope our next generations ask those questions and take action on it. They don't become so involved in consumerism, capitalism as my generation did, where bigger, better, faster was always the right answer instead of quality of life or values.
It has to be everyone coming together and say, here's this complex issue we're facing. What's our piece? And what's your piece? And how do we collectively address it?
We need more people to recognize that they too have a role to play, because this is an issue not just for the insurance industry or not just for government. This is an issue that as a society we need to understand, recognizing that each of us have a piece of the puzzle that we can contribute to dealing with this in an effective way.
I do think that climate change adaptation ultimately has to be led by the community, and that we need to use all this scientific research and data to find the solutions that make the most sense for our own individual communities, and only we can decide what those are.
If we learn that it's possible to do something and we don't do it, that will be a measure of our lack of intelligence. But if we learn of something that's to our betterment and we can do it, it's within our reach economically, then not only will we be better off regardless of how old we are, but our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be very thankful. We can do it.
Everybody has a pitch in this one. Everybody, not just a handful. Everybody has to pitch in to teach the benefit, foundation of living, which will be maintain the earth to the best of our ability.
And adapt and pass it on to the next generation is what we should do.